In the spring of 1887, on a dry grass flat outside the dying camp of Sweetwater Bend in the Wyoming Territory, a woman of 28 named Hannah Vay paid $2 for a freight wagon that three men had already decided was worthless. The wagon had stood at the edge of the freight yard for 11 years, its canvas long gone, its iron tires red with rust, its bed warped and split by 11 winters of sun and frost. The clerk who took her $2 wrote her name in a ledger and did not look up. He had heard her ask about the wagon, and he had laughed, and the two men loading sacks near the scale had laughed with him, and Hannah had counted out her coins without changing her face. What none of them knew, what no one in Sweetwater Bend had reason to suspect, was that the wagon held a thing sealed under its floor for 11 years, and that she was the one person within 400 miles who had been taught exactly how to find it. She had not spoken much in the freight yard. She did not speak much anywhere. She would speak even less in the months that followed, and the day the false bottom of that wagon finally gave way beneath her hands, she would stop speaking altogether for a long and deliberate season, because what she found there asked for silence before it asked for anything else. Stay with this one. The wagon wasn't what they thought, and neither was she. To understand why a woman would spend her last useful coins on a ruin, you have to go back to the man who taught her, and to the country that made them both. Hannah had come west as a child, in the back of a wagon much like this one, her father a wheelwright and her mother dead of fever on the Platte, before the family ever reached the mountains. Her father had set up a shop in a town that no longer existed, and there he had taught his daughter the trade that most men of that time would not teach a girl. He taught her the grain of oak and the grain of hickory, and how each took stress differently. He taught her how a wheel was built from the hub outward, the spokes seated, the felloes joined, the iron tire heated and shrunk on so it gripped the wood as it cooled. He taught her, above all, to read a wagon the way other people read a face, to see where a thing had been repaired, and where it had been hidden, and where the maker had departed from the ordinary for reasons of his own. When her father died, he left her three things. He left her his tools, a chest of them, planes and augers and a froe and a 12-pound sledge with a handle worn smooth as bone. The chest itself he had built, dovetailed at the corners and lined with cedar against the rust, and she had carried it west and west again across the years, and it was the one possession she would not have sold for any price, not in the leanest winter, not when she had bartered away her good coat and her mother's ring and slept three to a stove in a boarding house full of strangers. The tools were her father's hands, and her father's hands had been the only kind thing in a hard life, and she kept them oiled and sharp and ready as though he might yet come and ask for them. He left her, too, a single sentence, spoken near the end, which she carried the way other people carry Scripture. And he left her the knowledge that a wagon bed built true should ring a certain way when you struck it, and that a wagon bed that did not ring true was a wagon bed with something to say. The sentence he left her was this: "A thing built to deceive," he had told her, "is built by a frightened man, and a frightened man always leaves the seam where his hand shook." She had been 17 when he said it, sitting beside his cot in the back of the shop while the fever took him by degrees, and she had not understood it then, had thought it only the wandering of a dying mind. He had spent his last clear hour not on God or on her future, but on a point of craft, on the way fear shows itself in a joint, and at the time it had seemed a cold thing to leave a daughter. She understood it differently now. She understood that he had been telling her how to live in a world run by frightened men, how to find the place where their fear had made them careless, and that there was no warmer thing he could have given her than a way to see through the lies that such men built. She had not fully understood it until she was 28, and kneeling in the dirt beside a wagon nobody wanted. The wagon had a history in Sweetwater Bend, though few cared to tell it. It had belonged to a freighter named August Rain, who had hauled goods between the rail depot and the mining camps in the high country during the brief boom of the 70s. Rain had died in a snowstorm on the pass, or so the story went. His team found the following spring and his wagon recovered empty, and the camp had taken the wagon as payment against debts he owed the freight company, and had then forgotten it. 11 years it sat. The freight company folded. The men who had known August Rain drifted off or died. The wagon became a piece of the landscape, a thing the eye passed over until a quiet woman with a wheelwright's chest of tools came to town and asked the price of it, and was told as a joke that she could have it for $2 and the trouble of moving it. She did not find the joke amusing, but she did not argue. She paid. The clerk slid the 2 coins off the counter and into a drawer, and one of the men by the scale called out that for $2 more he would throw in a bucket to catch the rain that came through the bed, and the other laughed, and Hannah folded her receipt and put it in the pocket of her apron and walked out into the white morning light without a word. For any of them, she had been laughed at by better men than these, in better towns than this, and she had learned long ago that laughter was only the noise that ignorance made before the work began. She let them have their noise. She had the wagon. Then she hitched her own single mule, a patient gray animal named Solomon that she had bought lame, and healed herself over the course of a winter, packing his split hoof with pine tar and trimming it true until he walked sound again, and she rigged a drag harness of her own making, and she dragged the ruin half a mile to the lean-to she had rented behind the livery. It took her most of an afternoon. The rusted tires would not turn, seized on their axles by 11 years of standing, so the wagon came on as a sledge, gouging 2 long furrows in the dust of the main street, and the town watched it come. Children ran alongside. A dog barked at the wheels, and Hannah walked at Solomon's head with the lead rope easy in her hand, looking neither right nor left, as though hauling a dead man's wagon through the middle of town were the most ordinary errand in the world. By the time she reached the lean-to, the light was going amber, and her shoulders ached, and the furrows behind her had already begun to fill with the evening wind. She unhitched the mule and gave him water and a measure of grain, and stood a while in the dusk looking at the thing she had bought. Then she began to work. What did she see in it? That was the question the town asked when it bothered to ask anything. The blacksmith, a broad and careful man named Otto Krell, watched her drag it past his forge and said nothing, but he watched. The widow who ran the boarding house thought the new woman simple. The men at the freight yard told the story of the $2 wagon as a joke for a week, and then forgot it, because Sweetwater Bend was a town with little to spare for curiosity, and less for a woman who kept to herself. Hannah saw what her father had taught her to see. She had walked the length of the wagon bed in the yard before she ever made an offer, and she had struck it in 4 places with the heel of her hand, and 3 of those places had answered with the flat dead sound of solid plank over open air, and the 4th, near the front, had answered with something else, a higher note, a note that meant a second layer of wood where no second layer should be. A wagon bed is a single thickness of plank. This one, in one place, was 2, and a wheelwright's daughter knew that a man did not double the floor of his wagon for strength, because strength came from the frame beneath, not from the boards above. A man doubled the floor of his wagon to hide the space between. This is the part worth slowing down for, because the work of opening that space took her the better part of 3 months, and the work is the story. She did not tear into it. That was the first thing. and the thing that separated her from the men who would have taken a crowbar to it in an afternoon and ruined whatever was inside. She cleaned it first. She spent 4 days simply removing 11 years of dirt and rot and wasp nest and pack rat midden from the bed, working with a stiff brush and a bucket of water hauled from the creek until the original wood showed through gray and checked but sound beneath the surface ruin. The pack rats had built a nest the size of a washtub in the front corner of the bed, a dense mat of twigs and bone and bright stolen things, a brass button, a length of chain, the green glass stopper of some long broken bottle, and she took it apart by hand and set the curious objects on a shelf without quite knowing why, except that a thing carried so far by so small a creature seemed to deserve better than the fire. She found wasp nests under the seatboard, gray paper lanterns gone empty with the cold, and she cleared them. She found where the weather had got in and where it had been kept out. She worked slow and she worked thorough, and the town, glancing over the livery fence, saw a woman on her knees scrubbing a ruin as though it were a church floor, and shook its head and went on about its business. She learned the wagon's whole body in those 4 days. She found the maker's marks, the chisel notches a builder left to mark his joints, the Roman numerals scored into mating timbers so they could be assembled in the right order. And she found that the man who built this wagon had been good, very good, a craftsman of the old school. The mortices were cut clean, and the pegs were of seasoned oak, and the iron strapping had been let into the wood flush so that nothing snagged or caught. It was the work of a man who took pride in joints no one would ever see. And the doubled section near the front had been built by those same good hands, with the same clean mortices and the same flush iron, which told her it was no afterthought and no crude smuggler's box. It was part of the original design. The man who built the wagon had built the secret into it. That changed the nature of the question. A hidden space added later by a thief is one thing. A hidden space built into the wagon by its maker with the same care as the rest is another. It meant the maker had meant the wagon to carry something in secret from the very beginning, before it ever hauled its first honest load. And it meant that whoever had used the wagon last, whether August rain or another, might never have known the space was there at all. She found the seam where his hands shook, her father's sentence, made literal. Along the front edge of the doubled section, where the false floor met the wagon's headboard, the joinery was a hair less perfect than everywhere else, a line where the craftsman had worked fast or worked afraid, and it was there, after 3 weeks of study, that she understood how the thing was meant to open, not by prying up the boards. The boards were nailed and pegged and would split before they lifted. The false bottom was meant to release from below, through a mechanism she could feel but not yet see, a wooden catch set into the frame that a knowing hand could trip if it knew where to press. She worked underneath the wagon for 6 weeks. She built a cradle of timbers to hold the bed up off its wheels so she could lie beneath it on a bed of straw. And she mapped the underside inch by inch with her fingers in the dark, a tallow candle guttering beside her, her father's smallest tools laid out on a square of canvas within reach. The work was cold and slow and hard on the body. She lay on her back in the straw with the weight of the whole wagon a hand's breadth above her face, and she read the underside of the false floor, the way a blind woman reads a page with the pads of her fingers, feeling for the join, the seam, the slight unevenness where a catch had been set into the frame. Her hands grew raw and then grew calloused. Her shoulders ached from holding them up against gravity for hours at a stretch. Solomon, the mule, stood nearby in his stall and blew and shifted, and the candle burned down and was replaced, and the light through the gap in the lean-to wall went from morning gold to noon white, to evening amber and out, and still she lay there and felt her way across the frightened man's work. She found the catch. she found that it had warped. 11 years of weather had swollen the wood and seized the mechanism, and the very thing that had kept the secret safe had also locked it beyond easy reach. The frightened man's seam had become the patient woman's wall. She could feel the shape of how it was meant to work, a wooden bar pivoted on a peg, meant to swing clear when the right point was pressed from above, releasing the false floor to drop on hidden hinges. She could feel that the bar had swollen against its housing and would not pivot, and she knew, with the certainty her father had given her, that if she forced it she would split the housing and jam the bar for good, and the wagon would keep its secret forever out of pure stubborn ruin. So she did not force it. She lay in the straw and thought, and the thinking was as much a part of the labor as the lying down. Otto Krell, the blacksmith, came around in the 5th week. He had been watching longer than he let on. He stood at the edge of the lean-to with his thick arms folded and asked her plainly what she expected to find. She slid out from under the wagon, straw in her dark hair, grease to the elbow, and she looked at him a moment before she answered. "The truth," she said, "just the truth." He considered that, turning it over the way a careful man turns over a horseshoe before he decides whether it can be reused. Then he asked whether she would take a hand with the heavy lifting. Not for pay, he said, but because a man got tired of shoeing the same 6 horses and wanted to see how a thing came out. She said she would be glad of it. That was the whole of their bargain, and it held. He did not ask her again what was inside, and she did not tell him what she suspected, and the two of them worked side by side through the long evenings of that summer in a companionable quiet that neither felt any need to fill. It was Otto who helped her free the catch without forcing it. He had spent 30 years easing seized iron, and the principle was the same in wood: heat and oil and patience, and never the hammer until the hammer is the only thing left. They worked the warped catch with hot cloths and rendered fat for 3 days, drawing the swelling down, easing the wood back toward the shape its maker had given it. Otto would heat the cloths at his forge and carry them across in an iron pot, and they would lay them against the housing and let the heat work in. And then Hannah would work a little fat into the seam with a feather, and they would wait and do it again. It was slow past the patience of most men, and Otto, who had the patience of a man who had spent his life waiting for metal to reach the right color, marveled at how much slower still the woman beside him was willing to go. On the 3rd day he said, half to himself, that he had never seen anyone court a thing so hard that could not court back. She almost smiled at that. She did not answer. On the 4th day, near the end of a long afternoon, with the light coming low and gold through the gap in the lean-to wall, Hannah set the heel of her hand against the place she had found 11 weeks before, and pressed, and felt the catch slide, and heard, from inside the body of the wagon, the long-sealed false bottom finally give way. It came down on its hidden hinges with a sound like a held breath let go, a soft wooden settling, and then the cold, dry air of another decade rose up out of the dark and touched her face. She did not speak after that. Not for a while. Understand what that silence was, because the town would later get it wrong, would call her struck dumb or simple, or touched. It was none of those things. It was the silence of a person who has opened a grave and found it occupied, and who understands at once that the next words spoken will set in motion something that cannot be called back, and who chooses, therefore, to be certain before she speaks at all. The space beneath the false bottom was not large. A coffin's length, perhaps, and a hand's depth. The cavity lined with tin to keep out the wet, and the tin had done its work, inside, The air was the cold, dry air of 11 years before, sealed away from the seasons, and it carried up to her the smell of old paper and oiled metal, and something faintly of cedar. There was no body. She had braced herself for a body, and there was none, and the relief of that was its own small weight lifted. What there was, instead, was a flat tin strongbox, and beside it a leather satchel gone stiff as wood, and beneath both, wrapped in waxed canvas, a bundle of papers tied with string that had not been touched by a living hand since before she came to the territory. She lifted them out one at a time, in the gold light, with Otto standing silent behind her, and she laid them on the canvas square, and she began to read. What she read changed the shape of every easy story the town had told itself about August Rain and the freight company and the boom years and the men who had grown comfortable on the proceeds. The papers were ledgers, of freighters' true ledgers, kept in a small, precise hand, and they told a story that the official records did not. Have you ever known a truth to sit silent for years, waiting for the one person patient enough to dig it out? Hold on to that, because this truth had waited 11. August Rain, it turned out, had not been the failed and indebted freighter the town remembered. He had been an honest one, which in the Sweetwater country of the 70s had been the more dangerous thing to be. The freight company that recorded him as a debtor had in fact owed him, and owed a great deal more besides to a dozen others, because the company's owner, a man named Crandall Boyce, had spent those boom years skimming the difference between what the mining camps paid for freight and what the haulers were told they had earned. Boyce kept 2 sets of books. The ledgers the territory saw showed thin margins and honest poverty. The ledgers August Rain had somehow obtained and copied and hidden in the floor of his own wagon showed the truth, showed the names, showed the sums, showed 11 years of theft worked through paper by a man who never once raised his voice or his hand, who simply wrote the numbers he wished were true and trusted that no one would ever be patient enough to prove otherwise. She read by candle long into that first night, and the more she read, the colder the thing in her chest grew. It was not anger, or not only anger. It was the recognition of a pattern she knew from the inside, the pattern of a careful man building a lie so smooth that the truth, when it tried to speak, sounded like the ravings of the bitter and the failed. That was the cruelty of it. Boyce had not only robbed these men, he had arranged matters so that their poverty was the proof of their own worthlessness, so that a freighter who came up short was assumed to have drunk it or gambled it or simply lacked the wit to prosper, and so that the company's books, the clean official books, stood as the unquestioned record while the men themselves went to their graves believing the lie told about them. Rain had seen it. Rain had set out to prove it. And Rain had died on the pass with the proof under his floor. And for 11 years the lie had stood unchallenged over a dozen ruined names. Rain had been patient. He had gathered the proof. And then he had died on the pass in a snowstorm. And the proof had died with him, sealed under a false bottom that warped shut and kept its secret for 11 years, until a wheelwright's daughter struck the bed in 4 places and heard one of them ring wrong. Hannah understood kneeling there that she now held the thing that August Rain had died carrying. She understood that Crandall Boyce was very likely still alive, still comfortable, somewhere down the line where the railroad had carried the money. And she understood that she had a choice, and that the choice was not a simple one, because the easy thing, the thing a smaller person would have done, was to take the strong box, which held a not inconsiderable sum in gold coin, and to burn the ledgers and to keep her $2 wagon and her gold and her silence, and to let the dead stay dead. She did not do the easy thing. Neither did she do the loud thing. She did not ride to the nearest marshal with the ledgers held high. She had been dismissed too many times by men in offices to believe that a woman with a story would be heard. And she knew, too, that a man like Boyce, who had built his comfort on paper, would have papered over his crimes with more paper still, with lawyers and deeds and statutes of limitation, and that a single woman's accusation would break against all that paper like water against a wall. So she did the patient thing. She did the thing her father had taught her, which was to work from the grain outward, and to let the truth do the work that no shout could do. First, she copied the ledgers herself in her own hand, 3 full copies working at night by candle for 2 weeks, so that the proof could not be lost again to a single fire or a single theft. It was a different labor than the Wagon had asked of her, quieter, harder on the eyes than the back. And she came to know August rain through it, the way she had come to know the man who built the Wagon, through the marks his care had left. His hand was small and even, and it did not waver even where the sums he recorded must have frightened him, and she thought, copying it, that here was another man who had not let his fear into the seam, who had kept his books true to the last figure, even knowing what keeping them might cost. She copied his loops and his crossbars faithfully, and where the original had faded, she held it to the candle and puzzled out the ghost of the ink. And she did not let herself round a single number or guess at a single name, because a proof with a guess in it was a proof a frightened man's lawyer could break. 3 times she wrote it all, 3 fair copies in her own plain hand, and the original wrapped again in its waxed canvas and hidden, this time where she alone knew to look. Then she did something that cost her more than the labor. She found the descendants. The names in the ledgers were the names of men long dead, freighters cheated and broken by Boyce's skimming, and many had left families scattered across the territory, widows grown old in poverty, sons who had inherited nothing but the belief that their fathers had been failures. Hannah Vey spent the better part of that summer riding from one to the next on her heeled gray mule, the satchel of copied ledgers at her hip, and to each she showed the proof that their father or husband had not failed, had not been the drunkard or the poor manager that the company's story had made him, but had been robbed by a careful hand and recorded faithfully in a book that proved it. She still did not speak much. She had learned that the proof spoke better than she could. She would lay the relevant page before a person and point to the name and to the true sum beside it and to the false sum in the company's record, and she would wait while they understood. There is a particular silence that comes over a person when they learn that a grief they have carried for years was founded on a lie. Hannah had room for that silence now. She had made room for it in herself first. The riding was hard, and the welcome wasn't always kind. More than one door was shut in her face before she could open the satchel, for she came as a stranger with a strange story, a quiet woman claiming to know more about a family's dead than the family did. And that is a thing people are right to mistrust. An old man near the Sweetwater Ford heard her out on his porch and then told her to take her papers and go, that his brother had been a drunk and a failure, and no scribbling in a dead man's book would change it. And Hannah folded the page and thanked him and rode on, because she had learned that a truth refused is still a truth, and that some people need to refuse it once before they can take it up. She went back to that old man twice more over the months that followed. The 3rd time, he let her sit, and he read the page himself, slow, his finger under each word, and when he was done, he sat a long while with his hat in his hands, and then asked her, very low, whether it was too late to put his brother's name back on the family stone. She said it was never too late for that. He nodded and did not trust himself to say more. One of the descendants was a woman near her own age named Effie Sewell, the granddaughter of a freighter who had hanged himself in 1876 after the company ruined him. leaving a family that had never spoken his name again without shame. When Hannah laid the ledger before Effie and showed her that her grandfather had been owed more than $400 at the time of his death, money the company had simply kept, Effie did not weep at first. She sat very still, the way Hannah had sat still in the lean-to. Then she asked in a voice gone thin whether this meant her grandfather had been honest after all. Hannah said that it did. Effie put her hand flat on the page, over the name, and held it there a long time, as though the warmth of her palm could reach back through 12 years and tell the man it was not his fault. When she lifted her hand at last, there was a mark of damp on the paper where it had rested, and neither of them spoke of it. That was the moment, Hannah would think later, that made the 3 months of labor worth more than any gold in any strongbox. Word moves slowly in a country of long distances, but it moves. By the end of that summer, a thing had begun to gather in the Sweetwater country that had no leader and no meeting and no name. A slow tide of people who had each been shown a page and who had each gone home knowing what they had not known before. The story that Crandall Boyce had built, the story of his own legitimate prosperity and the honest poverty of the men beneath him, began to come apart at the seam where his hands had shaken 11 years before, when he first decided to keep 2 books instead of 1. Boyce himself was found, in the end, in a comfortable house in a railroad town 3 days east, an old man now, respectable, a pillar of a church he had paid to build. Hannah never went to see him. She had no wish to. The work she had set in motion did not require her to stand in front of him, and she had no speech prepared, no accusation she wanted to deliver to his face. The copied ledgers had gone by then to a young lawyer in the railroad town, a man named Pruitt, who had taken the case not for the fee, of which there was little, but because he had read the ledgers and could not put them down. The proof was concrete and undeniable, and it did the work that no accusation could. What happened to Boyce happened quietly and off stage, the way such things happen when the truth has finally caught a man who thought himself beyond it. There was no trial that made the papers in any dramatic way, no public ruin with crowds in the street. There was a settlement negotiated over the better part of a year, in which the estate Boyce had built was opened and weighed against the sums recorded in August Rain's true ledgers, and found wanting and slowly, painfully, in pieces, made to answer. Boyce did not go to prison. He was too old and too well lawyered for that. He died not long after, a man whose name had become a different thing than the one he had spent his life building, and whose comfort had been parceled out among the families he had spent 11 years robbing. And that, Hannah judged, was nearer to justice than any rope. She took none of the money for herself. This is the part the town found hardest to believe, when it finally came to understand what the quiet woman with the $2 wagon had done. There had been gold in the strongbox, August Rain's own savings, and there had been the settlement besides, and Hannah could have claimed a finder's portion of all of it, and no one would have faulted her. She did not. The gold in the strongbox she gave to Effie Sue and the other descendants, divided as evenly as she could reckon it. The settlement she had no claim on, and wanted none. What she kept was the wagon, and her father's tools, and the knowledge of what patient hands could do. And those, she said, on one of the few occasions she said anything at all about it, were payment enough. The town came around, not all at once and not with any grand apology, for towns do not apologize any more than weather does. The men at the freight yard stopped telling the joke about the $2 wagon because it was no longer funny, and had become instead a thing they were quietly ashamed to have laughed at. Otto Krell, who had eased the warped catch with her, told the story straight to anyone who asked, and he asked nothing in return for the telling, but that they get it right. The widow who had thought her simple brought her bread once and did not explain why. And Hannah took it and thanked her, and the matter was understood between them without words. Hannah stayed in Sweetwater Bend. She might have gone anywhere by then, might have traded on the small fame of what she had done. But fame was a kind of noise, and she had had her fill of noise long before she ever learned to be quiet. She set up a wheelwright shop behind the livery, in the lean-to, grown into a proper building, and she worked the trade her father had taught her, and over the years she taught it to others, including, in time, to Effie Solt's daughter, a sharp-eyed girl named Cora who took to the grain of oak and hickory the way Hannah herself once had. Cora was 8 when she first came to sweep the shavings for a penny a week, and 12 when Hannah first let her see to spoke, and a grown woman with a shop of her own by the time Hannah's hands had gone too stiff for the fine work. Hannah taught her the way her father had taught her, not by lecturing but by setting the tool in the girl's hand and standing close and letting her feel the grain pull true or pull wrong. She taught her to clean a thing before she judged it. She taught her to strike a wagon bed in 4 places and listen. And once, only once, when Cora was old enough to understand it, she taught her the sentence about the frightened man and the seam, and watched the girl turn it over and saw the moment it took hold. She kept the wagon. She never repaired it to working order, never put canvas back over its bows or new iron on its wheels. She left it as it was, cleaned and sound, but plainly old, standing under a roof she built for it at the side of her shop, the false bottom open now and empty, the tin-lined cavity a small dark mouth that had finally finished saying what it had to say. People who did not know would ask about it sometimes. This ruined wagon kept under a roof like a fine carriage, and Hannah, if she was in a talking humor, which was rare, would tell them only that she had bought it for $2 and that it had been the best purchase of her life. Years later, when she was an old woman and the territory had become a state, and the boom and its thieves had passed into the kind of history that no one quite remembers right, Hannah would sometimes sit in the evening beside the open wagon with her father's 12-pound sledge across her knees, the handle worn smoother than ever by her own decades of use. She did not strike anything with it anymore. She simply held it, the way you hold a thing that has done its work and yours along with it. The grandchildren of the families she had made whole would pass and lift a hand to her, and she would lift hers back, and the gray evening would come down over the Sweetwater country, the way it always had, indifferent to the small justices worked beneath it. She had stopped talking once, the day the false bottom gave way, because she had understood that some truths must be carried in silence before they can be set down in the open. She had carried that one well, and if you have ever held a truth that no one wanted to hear, and wondered whether patience could ever be enough against all the comfortable lies arranged against it, then you already know why a woman would spend her last coins on a ruin, and why she would keep it, open and empty, beside her for the rest of her life. If a story like this one stays with you, there are others, and they are told the same quiet way. The sledge in her lap caught the last of the light. The wagon stood open beside her, saying nothing now, having said it all. And the woman who had stopped talking the day it gave way sat on in the gathering dark, content at last to let the silence be a full one.